GamingBolt presents 15 amazing video games that had glaring flaws. Perfection is hard to achieve in any medium of entertainment, especially in video games. In fact, as far as our industry is concerned, some might even say it is impossible. No matter how excellent a game is, no matter how revolutionary, how fresh, new, and exciting, every game always has some flaws that hold it back from that unachievable state of absolute perfection. And while in some cases these flaws may be minuscule enough that, in the larger picture, they ultimately end up not mattering all that much, sometimes that isn't necessarily the case. To that end, in this feature we're going to take a look at 15 amazing games that in our view had at least one pretty big glaring flaw. A note before we begin though, in pointing out the flaws in these games, we're not calling them out or belittling their excellence. We still feel that these games are incredible. The title of this feature makes that quite apparent. Instead, the purpose of this feature is to simply talk about the issues that stand out because of their contrast to these games' otherwise excellent nature. With that out of the way, let's get started. Metal Gear Solid 5: The Phantom Pain. Let's start with the big guns, a game we can spend as much time talking about its debilitating issues as we can its genius. There can be no denying that Metal Gear Solid 5 is one hell of a game, a masterpiece in open-world stealth gameplay and systemic-based emergence leading to what were, in 2015, unprecedented levels of player agency. But there can also be no denying that it was a controversial game, for so many reasons, from its controversial ending to its jarring de-emphasizing on direct storytelling, to controversies that surrounded its release. But the one thing that hurt the Phantom Pain on a very fundamental level was the fact that the game was, in no vague terms, simply an unfinished game. All of Chapter 2 was essentially a retread of everything players had already done in the first 20 to 25 hours of gameplay, a bunch of copy-pasted missions that were hastily put together by the developers to meet deadlines. While the curious case of Episode 51 is also very clear evidence that there was a point during development when production of the game was literally cut off. The fact that Kojima Productions still managed to create what is undoubtedly one of the best games of the generation, in spite of all of these issues, is a testament to the Phantom Pain's sheer quality. The Last of Us. The Last of Us is a relentless game in everything it does, with all of its elements working together in perfect synergy to form a cohesive whole. Its honesty to its characters is amazing and shines through in both its writing and its narrative developments. Its world building is brutal and grim, portraying a sense of desperation and despair like few other games can do. And its gameplay is tense and restless, reflecting the messy nature of its world, where everything is an ugly scramble for survival. But even a masterpiece such as this one falters in some areas, most notably in its stealth sections. Now, don't get me wrong, the actual stealth mechanics in The Last of Us, while nothing more than rudimentary, are solid and work pretty well, making almost every encounter with enemies, especially those like the clickers, an exhilarating and terrifying one. It's the friendly AI that lets the game down in these scenarios, where Joel might be crouching in the shadows and holding his breath in terror while a pack of the infected shambles past him, only to have Ellie or Tess or someone else randomly start dashing around the environments haphazardly while creating an absolute ruckus. It's immersion breaking, and in a game like The Last of Us, which otherwise immerses players in its plot and its world, such things stand out way more than they usually would. The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. The Witcher 3 is one of many games that is said to have a combat system similar to the Soulsborne games. But while there are indeed a few similarities between the two on at least a surface level, when it comes to the quality, the gap between them is quite large. This is because combat in the game isn't about skill as much as it is about looking cool, which, admittedly, it does a lot of the time. But not only does Geralt's movements often feel slow and unresponsive, the simple fact of the matter remains that, unless you're playing on the harder difficulties, it mostly just boils down to two actions: attacking and rolling. The tools that you have at your disposal, the bombs, the traps, the crossbow, the aiming of which is pretty bad, mind you, simply don't come into play all that much. The Witcher 3's strengths lie in its immersive, detailed world, in its strong writing and storytelling, in the characters you meet throughout your playthrough, and the combat, especially when compared to these things, which are at a level that most other open-world games and RPGs aspire to be at these days. Combat simply isn't up to the mark. Persona 4. The Persona series completely changed tracks with Persona 3, and while that was an excellent game, it wasn't until Persona 4 that Atlus truly began to perfect their new formula, making even further improvements with 2017's Persona 5. Persona 4 was boasting one of the best ensemble cast of characters you will ever see in a video game, a jazzy, catchy soundtrack, and a story that kept players hooked from start to finish. It was a game that twisted and turned almost constantly, a game that made you laugh and made you tear up, a game that made you so thoroughly invested in its setting that within this world you actually looked forward to the day you could go to your part-time job just so you could increase your social stats. Unfortunately, it was also a game with terrible, terrible dungeon design. In fact, it had no dungeon design. All dungeons in Persona 4 were procedurally generated collection of narrow corridors, and it was as if the game wasn't even aware that they sucked, because they were also very, very long, making the act of getting through each of these an exercise in patience and an absolute chore. Persona 5 would go on to address these issues by having dungeons that were actually handcrafted, and while the quality of those is still a hotly debated topic, at least there can be no doubt that they were definitely a step up. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is the kind of game that comes along very rarely. It is a seminal, generation-defining title, a blueprint for what open-world games and emergent, system-based mechanics should be like. A sandbox that players can mess around in for dozens upon dozens of hours at end. But do you know what boggles the mind? That in spite of all of its accomplishments and all of its greatness, this is still very much a game that has a lot of room for improvement. There are many issues in the game that we could talk about, such as the lack of traditional Zelda dungeons, or the clear shortage of enemy variety, or its sparse narrative, but perhaps the one flaw that irks fans more than most is its boss fights. Since its inception, Zelda has been known as a series that has had incredible boss designs and memorable encounters, but that simply was not the case here. The Blight Ganons that we face off against throughout the game have little to no variation, and fighting against them is more of a matter of attrition than strategy or reading patterns, while the very final boss against Ganon himself, to say the least, is sourly disappointing. And while it's true that Lionels are fearsome out in the open world, can they really be called boss fights? The future looks bright though, because if, with all of these issues, Breath of the Wild was still as good as it was, imagine what Nintendo can do with its improved sequels in the future. Far Cry 3. Do you know the definition of insanity? Insanity is writing an antagonist that is truly formidable, hiring an actor whose portrayal of that character constantly keeps you on the edge of your seat, using that character as the centerpiece of most, if not all, of your pre-release coverage, and generate massive amounts of hype in doing so, and then grossly underutilize that villain in the actual game. That is insanity. Because while Far Cry 3 was an excellent game, with an engaging mix of bombastic combat, intense stealth, and a huge interactive open world, one of its biggest strengths was not a mechanic, but a character. The character of Voss, who lives on in the memories of those who have played the game or even watched its trailer even today. As it turns out though, Voss wasn't even the game's main villain. In fact, he died halfway through the story, leaving behind the bitter aftertaste of sour disappointment, and a gaping vacuum that other negative characters in the game simply could not fill. The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. Even almost 7 years since its first launched back in 2011, Skyrim is still captivating people like few others do. With its large, expansive world that is full of stories to tell and possibilities to explore, its multitude of quests and side quests for those who want to stick to the script, its vast web of systems that all interact with each other to produce memorable moments of magic, Skyrim is the kind of game that offers agency, freedom, and pure, unadulterated fun almost on a constant basis, so that even after you've played it for over 100 hours, you still want more. But in true Bethesda Game Studios fashion, this is also a game that is absolutely riddled with bugs and technical issues. From characters getting stuck in the geometry to the way their dead, lifeless eyes blankly look at you while their lips move out of sync with the dialogue. From the horses that can climb up almost perpendicular angles to the legendary blow of the giants that sends you hurtling to the heavens. Skyrim is a game that is teeming with glitches. And while some might say that a game as massive as this one, some glitches are to be expected, one only needs to look at games such as Breath of the Wild and Horizon Zero Dawn to see that that doesn't have to be the case. Mass Effect 3. You saw this one coming, didn't you? Mass Effect 3 was an excellent game, a culmination of a story that had been years in the making, the resolution of conflicts that had been brewing for 3 games, the conclusion of friendships and romances that were developed over the course of over 90 hours. It included so many memorable moments, from deaths of beloved characters to face-offs against formidable antagonists to large-scale climactic standoffs based on conflicts that previous games had built up. but when it came to wrapping up everything, right at the very end, Mass Effect 3 faltered. Many might say that it's all about the journey and not the destination, and you know what? Personally, I don't disagree. But man, the destination was bungled so thoroughly. Prior to the extended cut, Mass Effect 3's conclusion was a mess, full of leaps of logic and inconsistencies, of unanswered questions, and of questions answered unsatisfactorily. Of one of the most egregious examples of Deus Ex Machina that tried and failed to explain away things that we expected much better explanations to. It's true that other than those last 20 minutes, Mass Effect 3 was a stellar experience, but a trilogy as excellent as this one definitely deserved a much, much better conclusion. Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Super Smash Bros. Brawl was without a doubt one of the best games Nintendo ever made for the Nintendo Wii, alongside the likes of Super Mario Galaxy 2 and The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. It had excellent production values, one of the best soundtracks you will ever hear in a Nintendo game, which is saying a lot, by the way. A ridiculously large roster of characters pulling from all corners of the Nintendo verse, and the kind of gameplay you could play at a party or home alone for hours. But it wasn't perfect. It had its issues, because while it was a good party game, as a competitive fighter, it made several missteps. For one, the game was generally not very well balanced, while the problem of characters tripping was also a major one too. But the biggest issue perhaps was its problematic netcode. It led to frequent instances of lag, disconnections, bad matchmaking, as well as very limited options for custom games. You don't need us to tell you that in a game that is as reliant on online multiplayer as Smash is, a bad netcode is a huge problem. Bloodborne. Bloodborne is an absolute masterpiece, not only one of the best games of this generation, but perhaps one of the greatest games ever created. From its hauntingly beautiful world that is just crammed with incredible levels of detail to its masterful environmental storytelling and captivating lore. From its oppressive gothic atmosphere to its multi-layered, intertwining level design. From its tense, engaging combat to its excellently designed boss fights. There's just so much that you can point at in this game to highlight as its biggest strength. It didn't have a lot of weaknesses, but the most notable one it did have is its Chalice dungeons. These were procedurally generated dungeons that were, to be fair, interesting at first, but over time just became repetitive and boring. They were entirely contrary to the rest of the design philosophy of this game, which was lovingly handcrafted with immaculate attention to detail, and the fact that in several cases you pretty much had to tackle these dungeons again and again, since much of the game's best loot and weapon drops were exclusive to them, didn't help matters at all. It's fair to say that the Chalice dungeons in Bloodborne weren't nearly as bad as some of the other stuff we're pointing out in this feature, but when a game is as awesome as this one is, its flaws stand out even more. Fallout 4. Since its popularization and perfection in the Mass Effect trilogy, the dialogue wheel has been used in some variation by a number of other games. And while there are certainly a bunch of games that did it quite well, there are also some that, well, couldn't. Fallout 4 falls into the second category. Fallout and The Elder Scrolls are the sort of games that thrive when they offer absolute agency to the players, both in gameplay and in dialogue choices. And something like that inherently cannot be reconciled with the concept of the dialogue wheel. The options, by definition, are extremely limited, and as if having limited dialogue options wasn't bad enough, in Fallout 4 most of them were usually variations of the same option, so that ultimately Fallout 4's idea of letting you choose between dialogues was more often than not letting you decide whether to say something angrily, or worriedly, or sarcastically. Batman Arkham Knight. Who could have thought that a game could make players hate doing something as inherently awesome as driving the freaking Batmobile? It's everyone's childhood fantasy to be Batman and drive his cool car around Gotham. Rocksteady nailed every aspect of making a caped Crusader simulator. The incredible stealth used to strike paralyzing fear into the hearts of enemies. The crunching combat, brutal and beautiful, almost to the point of looking choreographed. The gothic, dark atmosphere, evoking every piece of media involving Batman that has been adored throughout the ages. And this, they screwed up? It's not like driving the Batmobile itself was particularly bad in Arkham Knight. Most of the times it handled and controlled pretty well. But the game had just so many forced Batmobile sections, which more often than not involved either inane platforming challenges or stupid puzzles. It was clear that Arkham Knight's strengths lie in either traversing the open world of Gotham or its engaging loop of stealth and combat. Unfortunately, the game didn't seem to know that. God of War 2. God of War 2 had many strengths. Its incredible sense of spectacle, the amazingly designed boss fights, the adrenaline-fueled combat, the sheer brutality of the entire experience. It was a game that was defined by immense production values and ridiculous amounts of polish, but its story, unfortunately enough, is little more than summer blockbuster popcorn flick fare. Don't get me wrong, for what it was, it worked perfectly. It got the blood pumping, it got you invested, and it got you hyped for what was to come, but it made no damn sense. Go away now if you don't want spoilers. The game's plot sees Kratos getting murdered by Zeus at the beginning, and him breaking free of the underworld to ultimately travel back in time to the moment when Zeus betrayed him to seek out revenge, and he succeeds. Only if Kratos does manage to stop Zeus from killing him, he never really died, and if he never really died, he had no reason to go back in time, and if he didn't go back in time, he couldn't stop Zeus from killing him. It's a classic, stupid time travel story. Add to the fact that Kratos even travels back to the time of the Great War to bring the Titans from the past to the present timeline. If the Titans left the war back in the past to go with Kratos, they couldn't have been there to lose the Titan War, and if they didn't lose the Titan War, then why the hell does this game, or its predecessors, or the past several centuries of mythological Greece even exist? There are several examples of a closed causality loop done right in media over the years, but God of War, for all of its strengths, is not one of them. Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy XV was subject to a long and troubled development cycle, wherein over the course of 10 years, it changed direction completely several times. In fact, as you probably know, before it was transformed and became Final Fantasy XV, the game was supposed to be called Final Fantasy Versus 13. The development of the game was so troubled, in fact, that it's a wonder Square Enix even managed to churn out a game, especially one that was as good as this one. But Final Fantasy XV was not without its flaws. Its story was an absolute mess, making little to no sense at several points, and absolutely no freaking sense at all on some occasions. But no part of the game was as bad as Chapter 13. The two chapters preceding this one were already turning into a chore, since they were more or less on rails sections. Also, they were quite literally on rails. But with Chapter 13, not only did the game become a linear, boring experience that funneled you from one poorly designed corridor to another, it also took away the one thing that was at the heart of this entire experience: Noctis and his bond in his interactions with his three buddies. Noctis all alone in narrow, winding, copy-pasted corridors was just a horrible experience, and one that significantly muddied what was an otherwise excellent game. Deus Ex Human Revolution. Deus Ex Human Revolution was an incredible comeback for a beloved franchise that had been dormant for far too long. It was true to what made the original game so great, and yet while it remained true to them, it also brought the series forward to a more modern style of interactivity and storytelling. Its numerous interlinked systems of mechanics combined to deliver a great amount of freedom in how you approached each objective, while the game also provided players with an excellent narrative in the backdrop of an incredible, atmospheric, excellently realized world. Truly a perfect Deus Ex game. Well, almost. Because its boss fights absolutely sucked. And no, we're not being too harsh here. We're not looking at something that was relatively bad in comparison to the rest of the game. They actually sucked. They were poorly designed, boring, and took away the one thing that made the game as great as it was: absolute freedom in how you wanted to tackle the problem presented to you. Sure, the director's cut made the attempt to improve these encounters, but they only managed to take something that was downright terrible and turn it into something that was passably tolerable. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.